Did Jesus really face 6 different trials before his crucifixion? Why was he taken first to the Jewish leaders in the middle of the night and then to Roman authorities the next morning? And how did a series of deeply unjust proceedings ultimately lead to the crucifixion that Jesus himself had predicted? In part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Douglas Bookman, we will walk through the remarkable and tragic sequence of events that unfolded during the night and early morning leading up to the cross. You won't want to miss it.
Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast, where we discuss all things Bible and theology because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave. In the first episode of this 2-part conversation with Dr. Bookman, we explored the Jewish background of Passover and the events that took place in the upper room on the night before Jesus was crucified. But after leaving that upper room, that night took a dramatic turn. Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and brought before a series of trials that unfolded throughout the night and into the early morning. These events are described as 6 trials of Jesus, 3 religious trials before Jewish leaders and 3 political trials before Roman authorities. These proceedings involved figures such as Annas, Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, Pontius Pilate, and Herod Antipas, and they ultimately led to Jesus being condemned to death by crucifixion. In today's episode, we're going to walk step by step through these remarkable events recorded in the Gospels and explore what was happening historically, politically, and theologically during these critical hours. And returning to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast to lead us in this conversation is Dr. Doug Bookman, longtime professor of Bible exposition and an expert in the study of the life of Christ. Dr. Bookman earned his doctorate at Dallas Theological Seminary and is a professor at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Dr. Bookman, welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
My delight. Thank you so much, Paul.
Well, before we get into the details of Jesus' religious and political trials, help our listeners to understand the key figures involved. Who exactly was Annas and Caiaphas, and what roles did they play in the Jewish leadership of the time?
Yes, well, Annas was sort of the high priest emeritus. He actually was made high priest in 6 AD by the Romans. That was a very pivotal time because there had been a rebellion after the deposition of Archelaus, and the decision had been made to provincialize, and they'd redone the tax system. So it was a very, very difficult time. To help them quell whatever disturbance and so on, the Romans had appointed Annas. Now, he was from a long line of important priests and so on, but this is a different situation now. He's really working for Rome, and he's deposed in 15 AD, but then 5 of his sons ultimately, and one of his sons-in-law is going to be high priest. At this point, Caiaphas is high priest. He's been high priest for some years. Caiaphas is one of the sons of Annas. There is, on the Western Hill, the second most beautiful and expansive villa on that very exclusive part of the city of Jerusalem, the walled city of Jerusalem. The first most being Herod's palace, but just very close to it is the priestly villa. And the villa belongs to whoever is the high priest. But this family has absolutely dominated, and they did it by courting and satisfying and bribing Rome. They were totally in bed with Rome. But nonetheless, they were very, very firmly ensconced. The situation seems to be this, that the family had a villa, their personal villa, south of the city on a hill which is to this day called the Hill of Evil Counsel because it was to that personal home of Caiaphas and his family. It was there that Judas had gone on Tuesday night to make the deal. That's outside the city. But now it's Thursday night, and Jesus is arrested after the season of prayer in Gethsemane, and his disciples desert him, and he is brought up to the priestly villa. And undoubtedly, it was expansive, and aged Annas undoubtedly had his own quarters there, and as did Caiaphas and so on, because this is where they would spend many of their days and nights. So at any rate, Annas is the aged high priest. He really is the kind of the power. He's the connection to Rome. All of the abuses that have developed in the temple at Passover time, the selling of unqualified animals and the usurious changing of money and all that sort of stuff. Josephus refers to that as the bazaar of Annas. So Annas seems to be the mind and wicked heart behind that. So he's very, very important. On the other hand, Caiaphas is the high priest, and he's a treacher. He is the primary villain. Very late in the drama of the trial, Jesus is going to say to Pilate, the greater sin, it belongs to the one who turned me over to you. That's Caiaphas. He is the primary villain by Jesus' assessment. So those are the primary, the Sanhedrin, of course, whether or not they're all there, but it's basically a body of 70 aristocratic men. Half of them are Pharisee and half of them are Sadducee. When Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin, it's not a trial in a formal sense. They're not trying to adjudicate guilt or innocence. They are trying to come up with an indictment. Their problem is that they have persuaded Pilate, and you can bet some drachma changed hands here, but they have persuaded Pilate to convene his judicial apparatus on a gate system outside of his home because the Pharisees didn't want to defile themselves by going into a Gentile domicile.
Which wasn't law, right? That's a tradition of elders.
Absolutely. It was born of hubris and contempt. Hubris, aren't we the ones? We're God's people, and contempt, you're not God's people, want anything to do with you. That's not the spirit of Moses, I'll tell you that. But at any rate, the point is that the Sanhedrin is going to gather. In the Old Testament, the priesthood had nothing to do with running the country. The king was the king and the priest was the priest, and never the twain shall meet, and ask either, Uzziah or Saul about that, if you know what I'm saying. But during the intertestamental period, and then the Hasmonean period, the Hasmoneans had seized both the high priesthood and the throne and so on. The Sanhedrin, the governing body that Rome had deputized to govern things local and religious, was ruled over by the high priest. So Caiaphas had that position. He's hugely important. So yeah, those are the Roman figures.
Is it appropriate to say that Caiaphas was the second most powerful person in Judea?
If you're talking flow chart, yes. But if you're talking actual function, Pilate had to be a lot more sensitive to Caiaphas than Caiaphas had to be sensitive to Pilate. He was he really was powerful. And he was capable of stunning anger and hatred.
When we take all four Gospels into account, we notice that John's Gospel alone records Jesus being brought before Annas first. Why do you think he's brought before Annas before then being brought to Caiaphas?
There has been in every culture and in every generation unbelievers whose business it is to discredit the historical veracity of the scripture. It's a wicked, satanic, hath God said effort. It is, don't get me started, altogether too much accepted in the Bible-believing crowd today, some of those same ideas. But the point is that one of the areas where they most confidently assert that the Gospels are absolutely contradictory, you can't put them together, is this period of, if you don't mind, prosecution, where first of all the Jewish leaders and then Pilate and the Roman officials tried Jesus. And the reason is because there are three discernible stages to the Jewish hearings or trials, and then there are three very discernible stages to the Roman trials. No one gospel gives you all of them. And so it is, in fact, that the really important element of the religious trial, the hearings before the Sanhedrin, is when they gather and get all these false witnesses, and finally, out of desperation, Caiaphas puts Jesus under oath and says, just tell us plainly, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? And Jesus says, yes. So that's the big moment. On the other hand, and that's in both Matthew and Mark, record that. Now, there is a third stage we can talk about that is referenced by Matthew and Mark, but only Luke records it. So you got three, and then John, writing late and really deliberately in the most God-blessed way. It's so important to reconstruct the life Jesus lived, and you've got to have the four Gospels, and we would be so crippled without John in so many deliberate ways. It's not accidental. He is supplementing. He's filling out the story, and so he gives us this account of how But before Jesus is, and he says that, he says he was taken first to Annas. Both Matthew and Mark say he was taken to Caiaphas. He was. But John says he was taken first to Annas. This is the middle of the night. This is somewhere probably after midnight. Again, you've got all of these Sanhedrinists who undoubtedly have been summoned sometime in the afternoon. We think we got him. We think we got him. We got Judas working for us. So they may make their way from all their homes, and they're staying in the very, very expansive, commodious villa of Caiaphas. But maybe they found a couch here or a pillow here, and it's late at night, and they're sleeping. So now the word goes out, we got him. We've got him. The soldiers have him. They're bringing him up here. So they're scurrying about and getting the room ready and waking up all of these old men and splashing water in their face. And while they're doing that, there has to be some minutes of preparation for the great room where the trial's going to be. So I think what happened is, and this makes all the sense in the world when you understand that the problem of the Jewish leadership is they don't have an indictment. They want to make the very serious case to Pilate that this man is a seditionist. He is a threat to Rome. You've got to crucify him. Jesus, all throughout his ministry, claimed to be Messiah. But, and it's interesting, Messiah, Mashiach in the Old Testament, it's important, but it's not a real major title for this seed of the woman deliverer. It's used probably 9 times in that regard. But during the intertestamental period, it becomes the one word that just sums up everything that the Hebrew scriptures have to say about this long-awaited deliverer. So Messiah means, above all other things, king to the Jewish mind. And so Jesus had claimed to be the Messiah, but he avoided using the term. And the reason he did that is because he knew it would arm his enemies. If he went around saying, I am your Messiah king, your Messiah, which it means king, means a lot of things, but it means king. It can't not mean king. And you can run to Pilate and say, you got a problem here. And it's a case that can be made. Rather than using that term, what Jesus does, and it's so clever, he takes to himself all sorts of titles and passages and so on, which any Jewish person is going to recognize as Messiah. But they're going to be innocuous and meaningless to Roman officials. Now, my favorite illustration is Jesus' favorite title for himself, Son of Man. 81 times in the Gospels, he refers to himself as the Son of Man. But where's that come from? Well, obviously, it comes from Daniel chapter 7, where you have this marvelous messianic, what you have is the 4 beasts, and after the 4 beasts, you have the Ancient of Days takes his throne, and one like unto a Son of Man comes and is dispatched to establish a 5th world kingdom. That's Messiah. Nobody can mistake it. Well, Jesus claims to be Son of Man, but I always say, you go to Pilate and you say, you got trouble here. This guy claims to be the Son of Man. And what's Pilate going to say? Me too. What are you talking about? And so on Tuesday, when the Sadducees come after the cleansing and say, by what authority do you do these things? And they are desperate to hear him say, I can do it because I'm Messiah, which is a valid biblical argument. My point is that as they gather to come up with an indictment, they've got an appointment with Pilate, but they want to be able to have witnesses. And so Jesus was so circumspect. Now let me stop. I can't resist that. There is a wicked, glow-in-the-dark, purple, wicked heresy built on that reality that Jesus avoids using the word Messiah. It's called the doctrine of the secret Messiah. It is a lie. It is absolutely indefensible at any level, theologically or exegetically, but simply because Jesus is assiduous not to use that title, they come up with the idea that he wasn't really Messiah and all this sort of stuff. No. The fact is that he was wise as a serpent. And this is why when they gather in the middle of the night and trying to come up with a charge, nobody can come and say, I heard him say he was Messiah, because he was careful. So Annas, I think, is just trying to maybe move things along. And so Jesus is hauled before him. He's just newly arrested. And Annas says, tell us about your teachings. And Jesus says, I've always taught publicly and in the synagogues and the marketplace. Ask those who heard me. Now, it's worth talking about, Paul, that there are a number of ways in which the Jewish leadership horribly violated their own very sacred, very noble, very Mosaic, as from Moses, canons of jurisprudence. One of the most distinctive elements of the law system that God gave at Mount Sinai is its stunning maturity and equity of its judicial process. And one of the most important was, in the mouth of two or three witnesses shall every matter be established. But that was understood appropriately to mean you don't interrogate the accused. One of the ways in which they are going to violate that is when Caiaphas, in a few minutes, puts Jesus under oath. But you have the same thing with Annas. And so when he said, tell us about yourself, I think clearly what he's saying to Annas is, listen, you're the high priest. Live up to the very clear protocols by which, according to the scriptures and according to all of your history, you are to conduct this sort of interrogation. Ask the witnesses. It is very polite. So undoubtedly, Annas had a soldier who was kind of his personal attendant, bodyguard, whatever. And when Jesus responded in that way, he cuffed Jesus. Now, another absolutely undeniable protocol of Jewish courtroom procedures was you never punish the accused until he is convicted. And so Jesus, I think, just very carefully says to the soldier, now, if I've done something wrong, then you need to testify against me. But if not, why would you strike me? I say clearly, I think without a doubt, he is taken to Annas, A, as they're making preparation for the greater trial, and B, for the purpose of Annas perhaps hoping he can solve this horrible dilemma in which they found themselves, where they want to make a case against Jesus as a seditionist, but they can't find anybody who can make that case. I think it's very preliminary.
Yeah, so that's Annas. So if we talk about three proceedings, maybe it's not official trial there, but he's before Annas, then he's brought before Caiaphas, right?
Yeah, and that's the Sanhedrin. That's the main body. On this night, the Jewish leadership, according to the gospel record, just really, quite frankly, embarrassed themselves in terms of dishonoring, neglecting the protocols which were so precious to them. And you know what? They were definitional. What distinguished Jewish culture, life, and so on was this system of such careful, judicious, equitable protocols and so on. You got to understand that biblically, when you reject truth that is manifestly set before you, there is a horribly dangerous hardening effect. Sin makes you more and more stupid, and the sin of defying the truth just absolutely corrupts and distorts, and you can't see things. Now, I'm going to suggest something here, Paul, and I think there is a dynamic at stake in this entire drama, and not just the trial, but the life of Jesus. It's hard for us to appreciate how unspeakably difficult it was to bow the knee to Jesus' claim to be God come in the flesh. We believe strongly in the genuine deity of Jesus. But what is the one evidence, the one overweening evidence to which we would look? It's the resurrection. He was proven, he was declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection of the dead. They didn't have the resurrection. They had a man, a Nazarene, a stonemason, I believe. And he had lived a very normal life. And then he had gone about doing good and working miracles and making the most audacious claims you can imagine. And they had rejected those claims earlier on. And even as the evidence began to mount, they hardened themselves the more. The rather stunning and no little bit embarrassing for the Jewish world violation of their own protocols of jurisprudence that are just that this whole narrative is punctuated with those violations. It cannot be extrapolated beyond that generation. That they had set themselves in opposition to him earlier on, and they had done so out of selfish motivations. You have that in Caiaphas when he says, if we don't kill him, the Romans will come and take away our place and our nation. And you have it powerfully in that parable of the husbandman that Jesus told on Tuesday afternoon. When the wicked husbandman saw the son, they didn't say, this guy claims to be the son, but we don't believe him. They said, this is the son. Let's kill him and take the vineyard for ourselves. So I'm not soft pedaling. I'm not downplaying the wickedness of what was involved and so on, even in motivation and attitude. It's very interesting that if you trace the Jews for Judaism and the anti-Christian apologetic Judaism sites and so on, and see how they handle this trial narrative. They all insist it's wrong, that Pilate was the one who really was the culprit, and the Jews were trying to persuade him to go easy on all this sort of stuff. But the fact is that you drill down, and what's their argument? Their argument is basically this: we would not do that. And it's not a bad argument, but they did do that. You've got to understand it's a factor, I think, perhaps of the stumbling block that Jesus claimed the deity was, but beyond that, of the hatred that had built up. So, having said that, what happens is now they gather. It's in the middle of the night. They can't do that. The reason you could never have a trial between sundown and sunup is because you couldn't convict without witnesses. And this is a culture where you go down when the sun goes down. So they gather in the middle of the night, and they're frustrated. False witnesses come, and there are all sorts of protocols that are violated by Jewish law. If two witnesses disagree, immediately the accused is set free. But then, again, Caiaphas, out of desperation and with a sort of a diabolical cleverness, if you don't mind, he puts Jesus under oath.
Matthew 26, verse 63, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. And then Jesus, of course, gives his favorite title for himself, the Son of Man. And he's on the hand of the power of God and coming in the clouds. So he's quoting Daniel 7 in his response, isn't he?
That's right. So Caiaphas put him under oath. He said, I adjure thee by the living God. And he said, tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Now, let me stop on that real quickly. Jesus made exactly that claim in Matthew 16. Whom do you say that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God? The Son of the living God. In John chapter 11, Martha, when Jesus says, do you believe this? Esther, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, who should come into the world. And then right here, tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? By the way, that's going to be kind of set in stone by John in chapter 20 and verses 30 and 31 in his purpose statement. These are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that believing you might have life through his name. So those are the non-negotiable claims that Jesus made concerning himself. And Caiaphas was familiar with it. Now, what's fascinating is, think about this, folks in the audience. Of those two claims, Messiah, Christ, Christos, Son of God, God, very God, which is the most fundamentally offensive to the Jewish mind? Obviously, Son of God. Are you kidding me? But at this point, as Caiaphas puts him under oath, what is the one part of that he's interested in? And it is Messiah. He's dying to hear him say, and it's so interesting to me that Caiaphas is sufficiently familiar with Jesus and his claims that he knows that he won't be able to probably get away with just saying, are you Messiah? So he says, this is what you claim all over the place. I need to hear you say it out loud. Are you Messiah, God come in the flesh, Son of God? And of course, Jesus in Matthew, because it's in Aramaic, and the strongest way to respond positively is you said it as you said. All that means is absolutely. You got it. That's exactly right. Now, I think Caiaphas was beyond what we can imagine, surprised and delighted. And all the Sanhedrinists now said, we got him. We got him. Now we can take him to Pilate.
They need something worthy of capital offense, right? Sedition by the Romans.
Specifically, sedition. And so he has just said out loud in the presence of all these men, I am Messiah. I am King. Now, after that, that's the second stage of the religious or Jewish hearings. After that, he is put in hold. By the way, Pilate is not entirely on board. He's not thrilled about this at all, and they know that. But let's just make sure, and what they've done in the middle of the night is wrong. And so what they're going to do is wait until the first hint of dawn. And when there is the first light on the eastern horizon, then they're going to haul Jesus back in. And by the way, while he is held, he is abused and blindfolded and slapped. I will insist, I think the Bible is clear, that's not the Sanhedrinists. That's the Roman officers, the Roman soldiers who are part of this. So they take him out there, they put him in hold, and they abuse him a bit. Now they drag him back in. And meanwhile, of course, Peter is standing at the fire and the third time betraying Jesus. And now as Jesus is hauled back in, and of course, Jesus has said before the roosters crow, it just means at the first blush at dawn. So Peter, for the third time, betrays him before the words are out of his mouth. A rooster crows. And now the Bible says in Luke 22 that Jesus turned and looked, and what was Jesus doing? He was being dragged across that same courtyard back into the great room. And this is the third stage. It's recorded only by Luke. Luke fleshes it out and says that they brought him back in, and they simply ask him again, are you the Christ? See, that's all they're really interested in. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to answer that. but you are going to see the Son of Man coming. And then I think they probably said, okay, for heaven's sakes, are you the Christ, the Son of God? Jesus would not tolerate any carelessness or truncation, if you don't mind, of his claims concerning himself. And so once again, they say, are you the Son? And he says, I am. Now they take him to Pilate.
If the Bible and Theology Matters podcast has been helpful to you, would you consider supporting this ministry with a small donation? Even $5 a month will go a great distance for this podcast. I want you to know that none of these gifts go to pay myself or my wife. All of it goes to pay people to edit and produce these episodes. We have a very small budget of only $500 a month to make this podcast possible. For much of the history of this podcast is simply my wife and I doing all the editing, posting, and interviewing. We've done it because we believe helping people think biblically and theologically really does matter, but that model is not sustainable long term. Your support can help us continue producing thoughtful conversations that strengthen faith and deepen people's understanding of God's Word. So if you're able, would you consider giving even just $5 a month reoccurring, maybe $25, $50, or even $100? You can give easily by visiting at FIM for Fellowship International Mission, FIM.org/give/Weaver-podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing this podcast with others and for helping us to continue to make the Bible and Theology Matters podcast a possibility. God bless.
There are going to be 3 stages of this Roman trial. In the first place, he's brought before Pilate. It's about 4:30 in the morning, and Pilate simply asks, he ascends his bema seat. He asks, what's the charge? And the accusers say, if he weren't a malefactor, we wouldn't have brought him. And Pilate says, well, then you go and try him. And they say, you know that we can't put him to death. I think what they're saying is, we got a deal here. We sent our agents to your agents. Your job is just to send him up. The city's going to wake up. We got to get this done before the city wakes up. Pilate won't do it, and he comes down, and you have the first of 2 times where Pilate takes Jesus inside the praetorium. The praetorium is the residence of the senior officer, wherever he is. And he interrogates Jesus in John 18. What happens is Pilate asks Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? The problem with that question is that it's very nonspecific. And it could be that Pilate is asking, are you the legitimate king of the Jews? Or it could be that he is asking, are you a seditionist, as they are accusing you of? And so Jesus asks a very legitimate question. He says, are you saying this of yourself? Or are you saying this because of what was said of me? And Pilate says, am I a Jew? Your own people have accused you. What have you done? So this is what I want you to understand, that there's one question on the table at this point, and that is, are you a seditionist? And let me say, this is so legitimate. Everything Pilate is doing is honorable and required. His primary responsibility as a Roman officer is to protect the Roman government. He's governing in a place that is famous for seditions. So there is nothing about what he does in all of his conducting this trial that is in any way ignoble or improper. But he asks, are you a sedition? What have you done? Now, Jesus' answer is absolutely magisterial. I cherish it. Jesus' reply is, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here, does not come this way. Now, folks, very, very quickly, this verse is appealed to by those who insist that Jesus came not to offer the kingdom, but to redefine the kingdom, and that the kingdom is here in some spiritual sense. Well, now, wait a minute. Let's ask ourselves. Jesus is alone in the praetorium. It's about 4:30 in the morning, and Jesus takes the opportunity to deliver a 1-sentence lecture on Old Testament kingdom theology that totally unsays everything the Old Testament ever said. I don't think so. But it's not just what the misuse, it's to miss what's going on here, because Jesus makes the point, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. My kingdom is not from here. My kingdom doesn't come that way. Now listen, after this interview, Pilate's going to go out and he's going to announce that the man is innocent. He is going to absolutely insist again and again that Jesus is not a seditionist. It's one of the most noble scenes in all of Scripture for this Roman officer to defend so at the expense of his reputation, career, and perhaps life. He insists the man is innocent. Here's my question to you. How came Pilate to that persuasion? There's only one answer. It's this argument right here. This is an absolutely airtight historical, legal argument. Sedition is not an abstract concept. Sedition looks like something, and it happens quite often in the Jewish world, and it always involves some pretender Messiah makes his way down maybe to the Jeshimon, finds some sort of fortification, comes out, falls upon Roman troops and Roman armories. Pilate didn't live in a cave. Jesus had gone up down this countryside for 3 years under his domain. Thousands and thousands of people are following him. Not one of them ever raised a hand against Rome. As a matter of fact, they're probably some of the best subjects, if you don't mind, that Pilate has. And I picture Pilate standing there as a reasonable man and maybe stroking his chin and saying, that's true. This man, if he were a seditionist, there'd be some sedition. And there is no sedition. Now, I'm telling you, this is a legal argument that totally, permanently persuades the duly appointed judge. And the rest of the drama of the Roman trial plays itself out in all of its parts as a consequence of this conversation. It's so important. But then Pilate goes on to say, they're still alone, and he goes on to say, are you a king then? Now, I'll argue that Pilate is something of a seeker, and this has nothing to do with judicial proceedings. And of course, Jesus says, I love this verse. He says, you say rightly that I'm a king. For this cause I was born, for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to, and I'm going to read the definite article as demonstrative. It certainly has that force, and I don't think it's generic, the truth, to bear witness to this truth, the truth that's before us, namely that I am a king, and everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Let me just say that Pilate, I don't think it was cynical. I don't think, what is truth? He's saying, oh my goodness, what is truth? What am I going to do with this? He goes out, he announces to the accusers, and that's all that's there. The city is still sleeping. The man is innocent. They go berserk. No, he's not innocent. He's a troublemaker ever since Galilee. You know this story, the second stage. Pilate hears the word Galilee. Well, that's not my domain. Maybe I can get out from under this. Herod Antipas is also in town. There are very, very important and explicit time constraints to this whole drama because he's only turned over about 4:30, and John 19:14 says he is turned over to be crucified at 6 a.m. So we only got an hour and a half to work with in this whole procedure. And some people have Herod Antipas staying at some palace that's never been discovered and so on. Herod Antipas, where was this happening? In Herod's palace. Who was Herod? That's Herod the Great. Who was Herod Antipas's daddy? It was Herod the Great. In other words, in that palace, that magnificent fifth of a mile long palace that Herod had built, Herod Antipas undoubtedly had quarters. And I like to say he probably had the same posters on the wall. And so when he came to town, he'd stay. So it's not very far. They just have to haul Jesus across the courtyard. Herod Antipas, he wants to see a miracle. Nothing comes of it. So while Jesus is being taken off to Herod Antipas, Pontius Pilate comes up with a really stroke of genius idea. And where he's sitting on that gate system on the western side of Herod's palace, he can watch as the city wakes up. And can you imagine with what wildfire speed the news that this Nazarene, whom we welcomed as Messiah and celebrated as he cleansed and controlled the temple on Monday and Tuesday, he's on trial for his life as a seditionist. And it's at a sort of an open air courtyard. And so they begin to make their way, and the hillside begins to fill with people. And I think Pilate sits there and thinks, now, wait a minute. I know these people love Jesus. I've got Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday to witness to that. And we have a policy where we release a prisoner at Passover season just to relieve some of the pressure. We've agreed on Barabbas, but I'll offer them Jesus. And certainly they will take Jesus. And so now here come the accusers. And once again, Jesus is standing there in the courtyard before Pilate. And I think Pilate stands and turns to the crowd, and he could be heard. It was this gateway that Herod had built, called the Gate of the Essenes. But He had built it for this sort of not only public trial, but public proclamation. It was a venue very, very well prepared for all that we read about in the Roman trial. So now Pilate looks out at the people and he says, "Who would you give me? Rather than Barabbas, I will give you Jesus," fully expecting them to cry out, "Give us Jesus." But in point of fact, and the Bible says that the priests persuaded the people, they began to cry out, "Give us Barabbas." Pilate is stunned. He can't understand it. And no matter what he tries, they insist that Jesus be crucified. And so the way I would put it together very quickly is that Pilate more or less gave up. And there was a standard protocol that when a man was going to be crucified as a seditionist, he would first of all be rather surgically scourged. And the idea was to open up lateral wounds all across his backside, because on the cross, you can't breathe without hoisting yourself up. And of course, your back is against that piece of timber with the splinters, and those are going to be thrust into the newly opened wounds. So I think Pilate finally, he said, "There's nothing I can do." And so he decided to have him scourged. Matter of fact, at first he says, "I'll scourge him and let him go." So he is scourged, and the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Now, really beaten and bruised and bloody, Jesus comes out, and in just a remarkable scene. And I think Pilate's heart is again, just gripped by the injustice of this. Now, Pilate stands at that outer gate before the people and says, "Behold the man. I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no fault in him." Again and again, Pilate makes that point. And now he says, "Behold the man." And they begin to cry out, "Crucify him." And this is in John 19, verse 6, where Pilate said, "Well, you take him and crucify him. I find no fault in him." Again, he is persuaded of the innocence of this man. Now, at that point, the Jewish leadership says to Pilate, and clearly because the Jewish leadership had despaired of the idea that they were going to get Pilate to crucify Jesus as a seditionist. So now they say, "We have a law." John 19, verse 7, hugely important. "And according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." That's why Jesus went to the cross. We'll come back to it. But when Pilate heard that, he was the more concerned. And so he took Jesus a second time. And by the way, in 1 Timothy 6, Paul says to Timothy, "I adjure thee by the living God and the good confession that Jesus made before Pontius Pilate." And in all the trial before Pontius Pilate, Jesus is silent. He never speaks except these two times where Pilate takes him alone and you have private conversation, first in John 18, now in John 19. And so, again, this good confession, he takes Jesus in and he says, "Who in the world are you? Where are you from?" I think he's saying, "What's going on here?" And Jesus won't speak. And Pilate says, "Are you not speaking to me? Don't you know that I have authority to crucify you and authority to release you?" And Jesus says, "You could have no authority, no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above." Then he says, "Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Now, I know it's almost universal that from above is read from my Father above. But more importantly, you can't make any sense of the following sentence. You'd have no power if it weren't given you from my Father above. And therefore, the one who delivered me to you, that is Caiaphas, has the greater sin. I think it's better to read in context, and certainly, it makes perfect sense that what he is saying is you could have no power at all unless it had been given to you by authority, Roman authority from above. In other words, you were given this jurisdiction, and that's why you have this authority, which is to say you didn't chase me down. You're only here because Roman authorities above you gave you this. Therefore, the one who turned me over to you, Caiaphas, he has the greater sin. Now, I think that's what Jesus means, but we still have the question, what is he saying? And this is, Paul, just my personal read. I think Jesus is giving Pilate permission to go ahead. You have to understand the situation here. This has to happen. Pilate has a role to play. He has demonstrated a reserve of character that you might not have expected him, but he is not going to do this. And I think Jesus, what he is saying is, Pilate, this is not your fight. You're only here because you were assigned this jurisdiction. The real criminal is Caiaphas. Well, however you like that, Pilate goes out. He tries to deliver him. they play their trump card. If you don't crucify him, we're going to tell Tiberius, the Caesar. I think on the one hand, that is a fearful prospect for Pilate, and he takes that into consideration. But I think more powerfully, there is ringing in his mind the words of Jesus, this is not your fight. The real crime is Caiaphas. But for whatever set of reasons, Jesus is turned over to be crucified, and he delivered him to be crucified. I like to say, and maybe my imagination has taken off a bit, but perhaps Pilate climbed the steps up to that bema seat where everybody could see him. He called for a basin and a towel, stood there and rather ceremoniously, carefully washed his hands, came down those steps, walked through that inner gate into the palace. Maybe as he did so, took that towel and handed it to a soldier, and then looked back over his shoulder and said, you do what you will with him. He never pronounced him guilty as a seditionist. He turned him over to be crucified. Now, there are 4 times in the gospel where Jesus speaks of being lifted up. And he says it's imperative that he be lifted up. John 3, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And then John chapter 8, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when they were saying, you're not speaking for the Father, he says, when I am lifted up, then you will know that I speak for the Father. And then John 12, on Tuesday afternoon, a poignant scene. But Jesus says, if I am lifted up, will draw all men to myself. Now, interesting there in John 12, after John the Gospelist quotes Jesus saying that he must be lifted up, will draw men to himself. Then John says this he spoke concerning the type of death he would die. And then in John 18, verse 28, when Jesus is brought from the Jewish trials to Pilate, and Pilate says, you go crucify him, you go put him to death. And they say, we can't put him to death. And then John says, this was in fulfillment of what Jesus had said concerning the type of death he would die. So here's the simple reality, that Jesus himself testified again and again that it was necessary that he die by being lifted up. It's a reference to the type of death he would die, by being lifted up in crucifixion. Now, we might have expected, and in fact, it almost happened a couple of times, that he would die at the hand of the Jews by stoning. But no, it was imperative that he die by being lifted up. The Bible is not explicit. But I think the best explanation, and it's hugely important, I think, is this. Roman crucifixion, especially of a seditionist, was not primarily about executing the seditionist. It was about putting down the sedition. And so Rome demanded that it be cruel beyond what we can imagine, that it be lingering, and an apparatus was built so that even though he couldn't breathe without hoisting himself up, he could do that. And the way they affixed his legs, his feet, his ankles to the cross was so that it wouldn't do any severe damage and he could hoist himself up. You couldn't sleep on a cross. You couldn't slip into a coma. You had to physically hoist yourself up to breathe. Very shortly after you got put on a cross, your rib cage settled in on your breathing apparatus and so on. So they wanted it to be cruel, lingering, public. It was always outside a main gate, and it was a place that was settled there. That's where crucifixions happened, because a gate is a bottleneck, and you got to get into the city, and you don't want to see this, and you might press up against the far wall and take your skirts and wrap them around your kids' ears and so on and hurry through, but you got to walk. And here's this poor wretch suffering beyond what we can imagine, and that is intended to retard whatever seditious impulse might be generated in your heart. But there was a fourth very, very important requirement that Rome demanded, and that was that there had to be evidence on the cross that the man was physically dead. And the reason was because Rome would not tolerate the possibility that the rumor would get out that somehow the poor wretch had survived, and so the sedition could go on. If you are put on a Roman cross, you're not coming down until you're dead. And there was physical evidence of one sort or another, and one of the most common was a spear in the side and the water and blood that flowed out, proving that the heart had failed and exploded, as it were. But the point is that it was absolute, physical, palpable, objective, undeniable evidence of death. Now, let me remind you that when Jesus came to Bethany to raise Lazarus from the dead, He deliberately tarried for 2 days in Perea so that when he showed up in Bethany, Lazarus had been dead 4 days. And that would mean the stone had been rolled over it. It had been chinked and so on to keep the smell in. And that smell, that stench, that death stench had begun to fill that cave, that little cave tomb. And twice we're told in John 11 that it was the fourth day and there was a stench. And of course, Martha says, no, don't roll back the tomb. He stinks. Now, when that death stench came rolling out of Lazarus's tomb, it was absolutely undeniable, olfactory, if you don't mind, evidence that the man had really died. You can't counterfeit that death stench. And you see, the wonder of Lazarus' coming back to life is entirely dependent upon the truth of his having died. Jesus said, it's necessary that I die being lifted up. Crucifixion could not be botched. And so the reality of Jesus' resurrection is entirely a factor of the reality of his physical death. And so Jesus, if you don't mind, contrived to make sure he would die at the hands of the Romans and that he would die the death designed for a seditionist in order that there be absolute and no question that he had physically died. So when he showed himself alive for those 40 days, it was undeniable evidence of the truth of his claims, Romans 1:4. And let me say, you didn't have to be there that afternoon to see the blood and water. If you are a sentient human being living anywhere in the Roman world, you know that if you are put on a Roman cross as a seditionist, you are not going to come down until you're dead. And so, on the one hand, it was absolutely necessary that Jesus die by being lifted up, by being crucified. And I would argue it was necessary because by reason of the dynamics and the protocols of that particular means of execution, the world was going to know beyond any shadow of a doubt that he physically died. And so now, when he shows himself alive, there is no denying the reality of his resurrection. So, think about this. It's imperative that he die the death of a seditionist. But by the same token, it would be such a perversion of all that is holy and true if, in fact, according to the record, he died having been pronounced guilty of sedition, even if it was a false charge. That blight against his record would be such a staggering disability with regard to making the case that he was the sinless Lamb of God. I have the greatest regard for Pilate. It's by reason of Pilate's absolute insistence, I think having been convinced of Jesus' innocence by Jesus' argument there, alone with Jesus in the Praetorium in John 18, but Pilate stood by it. So think about this. In the sweet providence of God, and really because of the role that Pilate played, on the one hand, Jesus did die by being lifted up. And therefore, there is no denying that he physically died and thus that he genuinely rose from the dead. But by the same token, he died not having been convicted of sedition, but having been exonerated in the most dramatic way. The one guy on God's green earth who had the authority and the capacity, who was authorized to do so, and spent the time actually interrogating Jesus to ask the question, are you a seditionist? The one man on the face of the earth, again and again, in the record, in the most obstinate way, the man is guiltless. I am not going to crucify him. So much so that finally his accusers have to say, okay, well then crucify him because he claimed to be the Son of God. And that's important theologically because it makes clear the real reason that Jesus was in fact crucified. So I'm going to say that the way Jesus handled himself before Pilate and the way Pilate conducted this all-important, legitimate Roman trial resulted in this twofold reality, this truthfulness about the crucifixion of Jesus. He did die the death designed for a seditionist, and thus you can't deny that he physically died, but he died that death having been entirely exonerated, exculpated, pronounced guiltless of sedition, because he is, after all, the sinless Lamb of God. And just to put a ribbon on it, when Pilate comes, and it was a rather standard, not ubiquitous, but it was rather standard, especially when a man died as a seditionist, to put a placard up. It's called the titulus. And it would make the point that this man is dying this gruesome death because he raised his hand against Rome. And of course, Pilate comes out and he puts up a titulus in 3 languages and says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And the Jewish authorities come and say, no, don't say King of the Jews. Say he said he was King of the Jews. In other words, he's a seditionist. And one final time, Pilate says, nope, what I've written. The man is not a seditionist. I have some confidence that we're going to see Pilate in heaven. I cannot help but connect Pilate's declaration, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, to what Jesus had said to him in the privacy of the praetorium just a few hours earlier. You say rightly that I'm a king. It was for this purpose that I came into the world, to testify to this truth, and anyone who is of the truth hears my voice. That titulus is Pilate confessing, I heard that voice. So put it all together, it leaves us with this stunning impression of reality. Jesus died a death which proved he genuinely died, but he died that death having been exonerated in every way possible of any guilt of sedition.
Dr. Bookman, thank you for helping us walk through the remarkable and tragic sequence of events that led from the upper room to the trials and ultimately the crucifixion of Jesus. When we understand the historical and cultural context of these events, the gospel accounts come into sharper focus, and we gain a deeper appreciation for what Christ endured on our behalf. What appeared to be the greatest miscarriage of justice in human history, the condemnation and execution of the sinless man and eternal Son of God, became the very means by which God accomplished the greatest victory in history, the redemption of sinners through the cross. If this conversation has been helpful to you, be sure to subscribe, hit that notification button, share this episode with others, and leave us a comment. These actions help more people discover the podcast, Bible and Theology Matters. Also, my soon-to-be-released book, Faith Affirming Findings, subtitled 50 Archaeological Discoveries That Validate the Historicity and Reliability of Scripture, is available on Amazon.com for pre-order right now. And with the purchase of the book, you receive 50 PowerPoints to help you include these discoveries in your preaching, teaching, and Bible studies. And along with that, 50 accompanying videos are available at youtube.com/at Bible and Theology Matters. Well, until next time, never forget, Bible and theology really does matter, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.